Your last day at the office was a Tuesday. You wore the same gray hoodie you'd worn every other Tuesday for 3 years. You brought coffee in the same thermos. You sat at the same desk, opened the same laptop, and answered 11 emails about a software deployment that was 3 weeks behind schedule. At 4:47 in the afternoon, you submitted your resignation through the HR portal. Not a letter, a form, drop-down menu, reason for leaving, personal. You walked out through the lobby at 5:03. The security guard said, "Have a good one," the same way he'd said it 800 times before. You said you too. You meant it more than he knew. Your net worth that morning was $67.4 million. You were 30 years old, and not one person in that building, not your manager, not the team lead who just asked if you were free for a performance review next month, not the woman in accounting who'd emailed you twice about a reimbursement form, had any idea. This is the part people get wrong about money. They think it announces itself. They think it changes how you carry yourself, how you dress, what car is in the parking lot, what watch is on your wrist. Sometimes it does. But sometimes it looks exactly like a gray hoodie and a thermos and 11 emails about a delayed deployment and then a 4:47 resignation on a Tuesday, and then have a good one. It starts before the money. It starts with a number. Not a net worth, not a stock price, not a balance. A number you wrote on the back of a takeout menu at 23, sitting on the floor of your first apartment in a city that was significantly more expensive than the one you'd grown up in. You'd been working for 14 months. You were making $84,000 a year as a junior software engineer at a company that built inventory management software for mid-size retailers. Not exciting, not glamorous. The kind of company nobody at parties asked follow-up questions about. You had no student debt. Your parents had paid for state school on the condition that you studied something employable. You had chosen computer science because you were good at it, not because you loved it. That distinction would matter later. The number on the back of the takeout menu was $5 million. Not because that felt like enough. Because at 23, living on the floor of a one-bedroom apartment with the IKEA desk and a secondhand mattress, $5 million felt like the border of a different country. A country where the rules were different. Where you could make decisions based on what you wanted instead of what you could afford to want. You circled the number. You put the menu in the kitchen drawer. You didn't tell anyone. The thing about working in tech in your early 20s is that everyone around you is spending money they haven't made yet. Not extravagantly, usually, just continuously. The nice apartment that's a little too expensive, but the neighborhood is worth it. The car that's technically within budget if you think of it monthly. The dinners that feel like networking but are really just dinners. The upgrade that felt earned because the raise felt real. You watched this happen. You didn't judge it. You understood it. You just didn't do it. Your apartment cost $1,100 a month. It was fine. It had a window that faced a parking structure and a neighbor who played bass guitar between 9 and 11 on weeknights. You kept it for 6 years. At year 2, you got a raise to $96,000. At year 3, a promotion to mid-level engineer and $118,000. At year 4, a competing offer that your company matched and then exceeded, $147,000 plus equity. Every time the number went up, you increased exactly one thing: your savings rate. That was it. The apartment stayed. The car, a 2012 Toyota Camry you'd bought, used for $8,400 cash, stayed. The thermos stayed. The gray hoodie stayed. The only thing that changed was the number in the accounts. People ask how you did it, and they're waiting for a different answer than the one you give. They want a strategy, a system, a specific trade, or a specific moment where the math suddenly became obvious? The answer isn't interesting enough for that. Index funds. Maxed retirement accounts from the first paycheck. A savings rate that sat between 65 and 80% of take-home for 7 years. No debt except one. And then one thing that wasn't boring. At 25, you were 4 months into a relationship with a woman who worked in venture capital, not wealthy herself, but adjacent to it in a way that changed what you understood about how wealth was built, not through salaries, not even really through startups, through ownership, equity. You'd had equity at your company since your second year? Standard stuff. 4-year vest, 1-year cliff, RSUs that paid out quarterly and which you'd been selling immediately, converting to index funds, treating like salary. She mentioned once over dinner at a restaurant you could afford but chose not to eat at regularly, that the people who built real money in tech didn't sell the equity. They held it. Or they concentrated it somewhere they genuinely understood. You didn't agree with her. Not immediately. But you thought about it for 3 months? And then at 25, with $340,000 in liquid assets and another $180,000 in retirement accounts, you did something that wasn't in any personal finance book you'd ever read. You stopped selling the RSUs. You held them, and 6 months later, when the company received an acquisition offer from a logistics conglomerate that needed exactly the kind of mid-market inventory software your company had spent 12 years building, you owned $2.3 million in shares that vested and sold in the same 60-day window. You didn't see it coming, nobody did, but you were positioned for it because of a dinner conversation and 3 months of thinking. You remember the day the wire hit. You were at your desk, the same laptop, the same open Slack channels, and the same email thread about a deployment timeline. You checked your brokerage account at 10:14 in the morning. The number had changed, not incrementally, not the way it usually changed, a few thousand here, a market movement there, a quarterly payout that you'd note and then forget. This was $2,261,440, plus what you already had. You closed the tab. You opened the deployment email. You responded to 2 questions about database latency, and then at lunch, sitting alone at your desk with a sandwich you'd made at home, you opened a spreadsheet and updated the formula at the bottom. The number at the bottom of the spreadsheet was $2.9 million. All in. You were 26 years old. You closed the spreadsheet. You finished the sandwich. Here is what nobody tells you about crossing a number you wrote on the back of a takeout menu. It doesn't feel like anything. Not nothing exactly, but nothing like what you expected when you wrote it at 23. You'd imagined something settling, some sense of arrival. The relief of having made it to the border of that other country. What you actually felt was something closer to curiosity. Because $2.9 million wasn't $5 million, and $5 million, now that you could see it from here, didn't feel like the number anymore. The number on the back of the takeout menu had been a proxy. What you actually wanted wasn't a number. You just hadn't known how to write the real thing down. You stayed at the company after the acquisition. The conglomerate wanted retention. They offered 2-year stay packages to the engineering team. Yours was $380,000, vesting monthly. You took it. You were 26. You had $2.9 million. You had no urgent reason to leave. And honestly, and this is the part you've thought about since, the part that tells you something about yourself you're still figuring out, you didn't know what you would do instead. So you stayed. You answered emails about deployments. You wore the gray hoodie. You kept the thermos. You added $380,000 to the index funds over 24 months and watched the total climb past $3.5 million, then 3.8, Then, in a year where the market did something unexpected in the right direction, past $4.4 million, and you sat with something you hadn't anticipated, the money was no longer the variable. You were. At 28, you bought your first property. Not because of the returns, though the returns were good. Because of something more practical. You had $4.4 million, and you were living in an apartment where a man played bass guitar 11 hours a week and the window faced a parking structure. And you thought, there's a version of this that costs $3,000 a month instead of $1,100 and has windows that face something other than concrete. You rented a 2-bedroom in a quieter part of the city. Your friends noticed. Someone called it a glow-up. Someone asked if you'd gotten another offer. You said things were fine. You didn't buy anything else. No car upgrade, no new wardrobe, no furniture that wasn't functional. Just windows. And a neighborhood where the restaurants had outdoor seating, which you used twice a week, regardless of whether you could afford it, which you could. The property you bought wasn't the apartment you were renting. It was a small 4-unit building, 30 minutes outside the city. $890,000. You put down $220,000. The 4 units generated $7,200 a month in rent against a mortgage payment of $4,100. The property manager took 8%. The net, after expenses and reserves, was roughly $2,400 a month. You didn't need the $2,400 a month, but you liked what it represented. A thing that paid you while you were sleeping. While you were at your desk answering emails about deployment timelines. While you were eating a sandwich you'd made at home. 29 was a quiet year. You got another raise. $212,000 base, plus new equity in the acquiring company that you evaluated carefully and decided to sell immediately, converting to index funds. Because the thesis for the original company didn't transfer cleanly to the conglomerate's balance sheet, and you'd gotten lucky once and understood the difference between luck and skill. Your total net worth crossed $5.2 million on a Wednesday in March. You checked the spreadsheet. You updated the formula. You noted it. You made coffee. You did not call anyone. Here is the thing about having money that nobody talks about. It starts to change the way you see time, not in a philosophical sense, in a practical one. You start to notice precisely what you are trading when you sit at a desk for 8 hours answering emails you don't care about. It's not money you're trading. You don't need the money. You're trading days. Specifically, you're trading the days at the front of your life, the ones where your body works correctly and your mind is fast and the possibilities are still genuinely open for days later that you will also have. The exchange rate stops making sense. You started running the math differently. Not, what does this job pay? But, what does this job cost? At $212,000 a year and $5.2 million in assets generating returns, the job was costing you somewhere between 300 and 365 days a year. That could be something else. You didn't quit immediately. You thought about it for 8 months. The thing you were trying to figure out wasn't whether you could quit. That was clear. You'd been able to quit for a year. The thing you were trying to figure out was, what do you actually want? Not in the abstract, concretely. What does the day look like? What do you do at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday if the answer isn't commute to a desk and open a laptop and answer emails about deployment timelines? You didn't have a good answer. You'd spent 7 years optimizing for the number. You hadn't spent much time thinking about what came after. So you did what you'd always done when you didn't have an answer. You treated it like an engineering problem. You wrote down what you knew. You knew you wanted to be physically somewhere you chose rather than where the job required. You knew you wanted work that felt like something you'd chosen rather than something you'd taken, Because it was the best available option at 22, with a computer science degree and a city that was expensive. You knew you didn't want to be managing a portfolio or thinking about money all day. You'd already built the machine. You didn't want to become the machine. You knew you wanted time to be recoverable, not every hour accounted for, not every week optimized, just recoverable, available, yours. You looked at the list. None of it required $67 million. All of it required leaving. Your total net worth crossed $67 million in January of your 30th year. Not from the job, from the machine. The $2.4 million RSU position you'd held through the acquisition had been reinvested into the index funds, which had compounded for 4 years in a sustained bull market. The 4-unit property had appreciated $310,000, and the equity position had grown. The retirement accounts, 3 of them across various structures you'd set up in your mid-20s, with the help of a fee-only advisor who charged $400 an hour and saved you what you calculated was several $100,000 in taxes, were performing quietly in the background. And a secondary investment, not index funds, made with $800,000 4 years earlier in a private real estate syndication that your venture capital contact had mentioned once and which you'd spent 60 hours researching before committing, had returned 3.4 times. $800,000 became $2.72 million. None of it felt dramatic. It happened in a spreadsheet. On a Sunday morning in January with a cup of coffee. You updated the formula. The number at the bottom said $67.4 million. You looked at it for a while. You finished the coffee. You went for a run. You gave your notice 4 months later. Not because of the number had been the number for 4 months. You gave your notice because of a Wednesday afternoon in April when your manager called you into a conference room to discuss a roadmap for a product you didn't believe in, for a customer segment you didn't care about, for a company that had stopped being the thing you joined. It wasn't a bad meeting. He was a reasonable man. The roadmap was reasonable. The customer segment was reasonable. And you sat there looking at the slide deck and something very simple became clear. You were done. Not angry. Not burned out in the dramatic sense. Just finished. The way you finish a book. Not with frustration, with completion. You walked back to your desk. You opened the HR portal. You submitted the form. Reason for leaving. Personal. You didn't tell your manager before you submitted the form. You didn't draft an announcement or tell your team or orchestrate any kind of exit. You submitted the form. HR emailed you 40 minutes later. You confirmed your 2 weeks' notice. You replied to 3 emails about the deployment. You packed your personal items, a charger, a notebook, 2 pens, a thermos, into a tote bag. You didn't take anything else. There was nothing else that was yours. Your last 2 weeks were ordinary. You finished what you could. You documented what needed documenting. You answered questions from the junior engineers who were going to pick up your work, and you answered them carefully and honestly because it wasn't their fault, and the work still mattered even if it didn't matter to you. On your last day, a Tuesday, a few people from the team said something kind. Your manager shook your hand. He said he hoped you'd find what you were looking for. You thanked him. You meant it. The security guard said, "Have a good one." You said, "You too." Your mother called 3 days later. She'd heard through your sister that you'd left your job. She said the word job the way people say it when they mean anchor. She asked what your plan was. You said you were taking some time. She said that was fine, but that the market was uncertain, and you were 30, and that a gap on a resume was harder to explain at 30 than it was at 25. You said you appreciated that. She said she'd seen a position posted at a company near where she lived. Senior engineer. Good benefits. She could forward it if you wanted. You said that was thoughtful. You said things were fine. She said she just wanted to make sure you were okay. You said you were more than okay. She said good. She said she worried. You said she didn't need to. She said she always did. You said you knew. Here is what nobody tells you about having enough. The silence takes getting used to. Not the silence of the apartment. You've always liked quiet, the silence of no urgency. You'd spent 7 years in a state of low-level continuous urgency. Not stress, exactly. Just motion. The meeting at 9, the email at 10:30, the deployment at 2, the Slack message at 4:52 that required a response before 5, the structure of being required somewhere. In the first week after you left, you woke up at 7:14 on a Monday. Your body's alarm, still set to the old schedule, and there was nothing on the calendar. Not one thing. You lay there for a while, then you made coffee. Then you sat by the window that faced something other than concrete, and you watched the street below and you thought, this is it. This is what you were building toward. And it was good. It was genuinely, quietly good. And it was also strange in a way you hadn't anticipated, because the thing you were building toward for 7 years had arrived. And now the next thing was just life. Not optimized, not goal-directed, not structured around a number you wrote on the back of a takeout menu, just the days. Yours to fill. Nobody at the office knew. You've thought about this more than you expected to. Not with regret, just with interest. You spent 7 years in a room with people who knew your work, your habits, your opinions about database architecture and deployment timelines. People who had opinions about you, who had a model of who you were. And that model was accurate in the ways that mattered and completely wrong about one thing. They thought you were a good engineer who needed the job. You were a good engineer who had chosen the job. The distinction never came up because you never introduced it. And now it never will. You'll be the one who left quietly in April, who gave 2 weeks, who handed off clean documentation and shook hands at the door. You'll be the person they occasionally remember when they talk about people who left and wonder what they're doing now. What you're doing is this. You wake up usually around 7 without an alarm. You make coffee. Real coffee, not expensive coffee. You've never cared about that distinction. You sit by the window for somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour. Some mornings you read. Some mornings you think. Some mornings you watch the street. 3 mornings a week you run. The same route, roughly 5 miles, through the neighborhood and back. You've started learning something you'd always said you'd learn when you had time. You have the time. You spend 4 to 5 hours a week on the financial stuff, not because it requires it. Because you like understanding what you own and you review the spreadsheet quarterly and meet with the advisor twice a year and the rest takes care of itself. You travel, not dramatically, not in the way people imagine when they imagine having money. No yacht, no private jet. Mostly flights you book 3 weeks in advance and apartments you rent for 2 to 4 weeks in cities you want to understand rather than visit. You've been to 6 countries in 14 months. You kept the thermos. You packed it in your carry-on. It doesn't feel like the life you imagined at 23 on the floor of the first apartment. It feels like something quieter and more specific and harder to describe. It feels like the days are yours. Your sister asked you recently, she asks versions of this every few months, whether you get bored. You thought about it before answering, not for performance, because it's a real question and it deserved a real answer. You said sometimes. She seemed surprised. You explained, boredom is just what happens when you haven't yet figured out what you actually want to do with the space you've created. It's not a problem with the space. It's a signal from yourself about yourself. She asked what you do when that happens. You said you pay attention to it. She said that sounded exhausting. You said it was, sometimes, but less exhausting than filling the space with things you don't want in order to avoid feeling it. She said she still didn't fully understand what you'd done or how. You said that was okay. She said maybe you should explain it to her sometime. You said maybe you haven't yet. The spreadsheet today reads $71.2 million. You haven't worked in 14 months. The machine runs. The property generates income. The index funds do what they do. The retirement accounts compound. You do nothing to make this happen. You built a thing that doesn't need you, which is, it turns out, exactly what you were trying to build. There's a question people want you to answer. You can feel it in the way the conversation goes when someone finds out, and very few people find out, because you don't volunteer at what you've done. They want to know, was it worth it? 7 years of the gray hoodie. 7 years of the thermos. 7 years of watching people around you buy things you could have bought and consciously not buying them. 7 years of the spreadsheet on Sunday mornings. 7 years of staying when you could have left. Was it worth it? You turn the question over when people ask it. You turn it over when you're running, usually 5 miles of turning it over. The honest answer is worth it. Compared to what? You're not sure what the alternative would have been. You're not sure that spending the $2.3 million when it arrived, the apartment upgrade, the car, the watch, the dinners every night instead of twice a week, would have given you a better 7 years. The life you lived in those 7 years was your life. You were there for it. You were present for it. It was quiet and ordinary and mostly fine, with occasional stretches of genuine pleasure. And it led here, to a Tuesday in April, to have a good one, to a window that faces something other than concrete, to a morning that belongs to no one but you. You think about the man who played bass guitar 11 hours a week. You wonder if he still lives there. You hope he does. Your mother sent a job listing last week. Senior staff engineer at a healthcare software company. She said the compensation was competitive and they had good benefits, and it might be good for you to have structure again. You read the listing. It seemed like a reasonable job. You thanked her. You said things were good. She said she was glad, but that she still worried. You said you knew. She said she'd always believed you'd figure it out. You said thank you. You meant it. The thermos is on the counter, coffee's ready, the window's there.